long I know you now? About 6 weeks? No, 6 years, I mean, something like that. Come on up here. This is our youngest pastor. Pastor Jim's going to speak to you tonight, and just allow the Lord to use you, brother, okay? Give the Lord praise tonight.
Yes. Where'd Susan go? No, I don't need her. I thought of her last night. I was asked last night if God had given me a word for tonight. I wasn't scheduled to speak, at least not that I knew of. And I said, well, no. Thank you. And the person asking me that question said, so do you think God will give you a message between now and tomorrow night? And I said, if you can arrange it between the World Series and my sleep, maybe. Who else stayed up really squirrely early this morning and watched the game? I forgot about him being an Indians fan. I knew he liked the Reds. I figured he'd go with the National League team like I did, but nope. It was a good game. I stayed up till 12:30 this morning. With me being a Reds fan, I liked the three former Reds being on the Cubs, so I thought, okay, I'll handle that. But it was a good series all the way through. While I was watching it, God was kind enough to give me the message during the commercial breaks. And as he was giving it to me, I thought of Susan and a previous message that she had spoken during Sunday school probably 3 or 4 years ago. So you guys are recording this, right? Okay, so she can see it, hear it, whatever. And what you were speaking goes right alongside of what this is about. What Bobby put on Facebook earlier today goes right alongside of it. So I said, okay, God, I get the hint. Who here remembers Nehemiah? Not like you were hanging out with him, but I mean, like, okay. Yes, he's right there. Yeah. We're talking about Nehemiah, the guy that said, I need to go help rebuild a wall. Okay? We talk about Joshua sometimes and how he needed to go knock down a wall. Right now we're going to talk about the challenges building a wall and how sometimes those challenges seem like they're not able to be overcome. But at the same time, we've got a God that can do anything he wants, and he can help us out through any of those challenges. So we're going to start with and go through. Don't get scared on me here. We're going to go through the first few chapters. Parts of it I will read, parts of it I will recount, so that way it speeds along a little bit. But in between, God has little messages to go along with it. Excuse me for my throat. The weather's been messing with me a little bit. In chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, this is Nehemiah the prophet talking. He says, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah, it came to pass in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. And then he goes on to explain why. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. So it was when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So Nehemiah got the bad news about the wall of Jerusalem and how it's disrepair, how it was torn down, how it was burned. What in the world is so important about a wall or the walls of Jerusalem? What does it represent? What does a wall represent around a city? Safety, protection, yeah. When Pastor and I were over there in Israel a couple of Februaries ago, they were talking about, some of the tour guides folks were talking about how what we know as the Wailing Wall, they don't usually refer to it as that anymore, because they've been doing a lot of archaeological digs underneath and found out the reason for the wailing is no more. The wailing, or the crying out for the destruction of the old Jerusalem, has no reason anymore, because it's not as destroyed as they thought it was. The Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, is small compared to what it used to be. But when they started digging underneath the ground, they found out that it actually is still remaining just underground. So they're digging it up. As the politics and things get aired out, they start digging some more, and they keep digging, and they realize, hey, we've been wailing all these years and didn't need to be. It's been here the whole time. So now they're trying to get folks to reference it as the Western Wall. But it's so important throughout all these centuries to the Jews to represent, this is where God brought them, this was the promised land, this is where they were supposed to call home, and to have your home devastated is a big deal. To have that wall of safety knocked down is a big deal. And so that's why Nehemiah just broke down and cried. He broke down and fasted. So he got the bad news. What does he do with it? We have options. We have options to do things when we get bad news. We could sit down and cry for a while, or we could sit down and cry for a very long time and just give up. Throw our hands up and say, I don't know where you've been, God. What's going on? I must not have been hearing you all these years. Whatever the situation is in our life, if we have a wall that's knocked down that we thought was secure, that we thought God had a hold of, and we see that it's down, sometimes we have that tendency. Sometimes we have that tendency to say, okay, God, what's up? What is going on? Why have you left us? But Nehemiah gave us a good example. Yes, he took his time to mourn. He took his time to ask questions and to fast and pray. That was the last part of that verse 4. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. See, he didn't give up. He was talking to God. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't yelling at him. He was praying. And then in verses 5 through 11, this is what he did. He said, and I said, I pray, Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments, please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. Remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast out to the farthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there and bring them to the place which I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Now these are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name, and let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. And what man? He says, for I was the king's cupbearer. So he worked in the king's palace. He worked for the king. He had connections. But he wasn't quite sure how to approach that, how to use those connections. The big connection he knew how to use, he went and petitioned God, number one. That was his first step. He cried about it for a little bit, and then he said, okay, God, I need your help. And that's what we need to be doing. Anytime we face an obstacle that where our wall is knocked down, we need to be asking God for help. So he goes ahead and he sets that purpose. He sets a purpose by saying, okay, God, this is what needs to happen. I need your help. I need you to please remember who we are, your servants, who you set us apart to be. So then in chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, he takes it to the next step. He says, and it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. Therefore the king said to me, why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart. So I became dreadfully afraid and said to the king, May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire? Then the king said to me, Well, what do you request? So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. So he has a purpose. He has a plan. He wants to go fix this wall. He wants to go take care of things that have been put into disrepair. And so he has some responsibilities where he's at. He's not living in Jerusalem at this time, but he goes to his authority at the place where he's working, and he says, Can I have a leave of absence? I need to go fix things back at my parents' place, basically, where my family is from. The king, apparently, is very impressed with him in the first place and says, okay, later on he says, I'll go ahead and give you permission, and I'll give you some letters of passage through the land so that way you can make it there safely. So he goes, but he doesn't go unnoticed. Anytime we have a wall that we're trying to rebuild, anytime we have a challenge that we need to be facing to overcome, Satan's going to notice. He has a plan trying to knock us back down. He has a plan trying to knock our challenge or our wall back down. So what he does is he says in verse 10, he sends somebody else. It says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. So if you're like me and you like watching some movies, and you're watching this scene in the movie, Nehemiah just got permission from the king to go out and rebuild this wall. So he's got a journey ahead of him. So he starts off. Meanwhile, the camera pans over here, and you see these two men look at each other and say, And then the screen fades to black, and you hear the music, dun, dun, dun. That's basically what just happened here, all right? You know something's up. These two guys are up to no good, but you don't know what. So in verses 11 through 16, Nehemiah goes on. He doesn't see those two guys behind him, scouting out behind him. He goes ahead, and he scouts and looks at the land. He says, okay, I'm going to go and see how bad these walls are for myself, but I'm not going to tell anybody what I'm there for. This is the part where I'm skimming a little bit. So he goes over there, and he does that. And then in verses 17 through 18, he says, and he's talking to the folks that live there. Okay, so he'd already made it to Jerusalem. He's looking around. Finally, he talks to some of them that are upset and torn up about the fact that their walls are torn down. He said, Then I said to them, this is verse 17, You see the distress that we're in, how Jerusalem lies waste and its gates are burned with fire? Come, and let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them of the hand of my God, which had been good upon me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me. So they said, Let us rise up and build. Then they set their hands to this good work. So they stood up and they said, Let's do it. He's gathered the rally folks, basically. This is the scene from Braveheart when he's saying, we need our freedom. We need to go ahead and build everything. We need to get everything ready to go. So he's gathered his army of builders. He's getting ready to roll out and start building. But then that whole camera thing happens again. In verses 19 through 20, it says, But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, the two that we had already met, and Geshem the Arab, so now they bring a third buddy, and they say, when they heard of it, they laughed at us and despised us and said, What is this thing that you're doing? Will you rebel against the king? So I answered them and said to them, The God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore we his servants will arise and build, but you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem. So Nehemiah has his buddies gathered up, ready to build, ready to go to war, basically, in essence, to build against the enemy. Okay? The enemy comes up and says, Oh, you guys can't do anything. We're going to sit back and laugh and call you names and do all these things. How many times do we have a plan? We're all gung-ho, ready to roll for what God has already planted in our heart. He gives us a mission. He gives us a purpose. And we start telling people about it. And then you've got a couple of naysayers that pop up and say, but you know what? No, that's not going to work because of this, this, and this. I can't see you guys doing this. No, you're too short. You're too tall. You don't have enough money. You don't have this. You don't have that. I'm going to sit back and laugh while you try to build this silly wall. That's not exactly encouraging, right? But what does Nehemiah do as a reaction? He doesn't just get angry. He doesn't just sit back and say, oh, you know what, you guys are right. I didn't know what I was talking about. I traveled all this way for nothing. Let me go home with my tail tucked between my legs. What he does is he says, the God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and build. Basically, nanner, 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 we're going to do what God said. And then he said, but you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem. You don't know what you're talking about. That's basically it. So, at that point, they go ahead and they start rebuilding the wall. They start repairing the damages, little by little. Chapter 3 basically splits apart the wall and says, in this section, these families worked. This section, these families worked. And it continues on down the line. And then the enemies get upset again. So chapter 4, verses 1 through 3 say this, but it so happened when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, because he saw success. He saw that they were doing what God said they were going to do. He got upset. So he says, when he heard that we were rebuilding the wall, that he was furious, very indignant, and mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren and the army of Samaria, see now he's gathered more people, and said, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish? Stones that are burned? See, he's trying to get them, and then he says, now Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, whatever they build, even if a fox goes up on it, he'll break down their stone wall. So they said, okay, yeah, you're building a wall. They're finally given a little bit of acknowledgement there. But he said, but if a fox crawls up on top, it's going to fall over. So they're recognizing the fact that they're getting something accomplished. That means they're doing something right. When Satan is upset enough that he's acknowledging the fact that you're succeeding in something, you're doing something right. And it makes him angry. That's why we see all these things happening that you were talking about a few minutes ago. That's why we see all these things happening in our families, in our schools, in politics, in government, and everywhere else. All these things are because Satan is upset. So in verses 4 through 6, Nehemiah says, hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn the reproach on their own heads and give them as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity and do not let their sin be blotted out from before you, for they have provoked you to anger before the builders. And then, so we built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. So they asked God for protection and continued on. Sometimes that's all we need to do. Sometimes we just need to say, Lord, I know I'm on the right path. This is what you gave me. It's time to keep going. Just continue to protect me as I do what you asked me to do. So then later come the physical attacks. And we're almost done here for this message. But the physical attacks, Nehemiah starts getting letters in the mail saying, hey, I need to meet you. I need you to come out here and meet me over here so that way we can discuss this wall that you're building. I need to go ahead and discuss the success that you're having and join forces. Well, he knew it was a trap, so he would always send a messenger to relay his message and say, I don't think so. I know better than that. So they try to send another messenger and say, hey, okay, well, maybe I can go ahead and meet with you over here. No, I'm not going to do that either. And then another time, one of his own people who happened to be a spy comes up to him and says, how about, I heard this plot, Nehemiah. I want to save your life. We need you to go hide in the palace, or the synagogue or somewhere. Excuse me a second. I think it's the synagogue. It's chapter 4. Ella, if you find it faster than me, please let me know. But I think it's in chapter 4. Anyway, they said basically, we need you to go hide. And Nehemiah said, no, I'm not going to use God's house for protection like that. I'm not going to be doing that. That's not the purpose of his house. And it turns out it really was a plot. It was a plot for him to go ahead and agree, say, okay, yes, I'm scared for my life. I'm going to go hide in God's house. And then now the bad guys are going to have some dirt on him. Say, hey, he's using God's house for something that it wasn't intended for. And they would have tried to go ahead and get the folks that were behind Nehemiah to rally against him. Nehemiah wasn't falling for that either, because God gave him wisdom. When we are on a mission for God, not like the Blues Brothers, but when we're on a mission for God, he gives us wisdom when we ask him. Okay? He gives us these things because he wants us to be able to accomplish what he's set before us to go ahead and accomplish. So then, now the local folks are getting nervous because they knew how much power those other guys had. So they start talking to Nehemiah and saying, man, I don't know about this. I don't know how we can handle all of this. So he devises a plan. He says, okay, if you guys are so scared, let's go ahead and do it this way. Half of you stop working. Half of you continue to work. The other half stand behind the other half. Okay. Half number one, work. Half number two, stand there with your sword and shield and don't move. If you're so scared of somebody coming, you stand there and guard yourselves. So they did. They took twice as long now because they weren't putting their trust in God. They said, okay, we're going to go ahead and trust God to a degree, but now we're going to go ahead and stand here with our armor, with our swords, with our shields, with our whatever else they had, and stand behind Bob, the builder, for lack of a better word. All right? So they're standing behind him and letting him do the work, and then they change shifts. They flip-flop and take turns because they were so scared. Nehemiah said, we still got to get this done. We're going to go ahead and continue on this way then. So they start doing that, and then chapter 7, the wall is built completely. Not just halfway, not just with little holes in the middle of it or anything like that, but when it was complete. And it says, then, chapter 7, verses 1 through 2, then it was when the wall was built and I had hung the doors, when the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites had been appointed, that I gave the charge of Jerusalem to my brother Hanani, and Hananiah, the leader of the citadel, for he was a faithful man and feared God more than many. So Nehemiah had a job to do. He came into town, he built the wall, he got everybody to rally behind him to build this wall that represented security, that represented home, that represented freedom, all at the same time. And he said, my job's done. I've shown you guys how to do it. And then he went on a little bit later, and he was showing them what else he needed to do. And that was to go ahead and show them the law of the Lord. They had forgotten it. So as you read the rest of Nehemiah on your own, you'll see what kind of revelation that the folks there had with the law of the Lord. And it was a time of mourning for a lot of them because they realized how much they disappointed God, how much they had left God behind in their everyday walk. But Nehemiah said, no, the joy of the Lord is your strength. This is what you need to do. You need to go ahead and rejoice that God has saved you through all of this. You need to rejoice that God has brought you through this. And you need to rejoice because he's given you this goal, and we accomplished it, and now we can keep on moving. This is what God wants us to do. He wants us to take these moments where we have broken walls or broken portions of walls, and he wants us to go ahead and say, build. Just keep going. Just keep moving. So we got to keep walking on. We got to keep moving on. When God tells us that we have a mission, we just got to keep moving on. And that's it. This is all there is to it. It can be difficult. There are moments where we need to take a break and get a drink of water. But at the same time, we need to keep focused on moving forward. Pastor.
Thank you, Pastor Jim. Yes, we've got to keep moving. Got to keep working for the Lord. You know, I tell people all the time, we don't work to be saved, but we work because we are saved. And so, never an idle moment. You know, God's always got something for his people to do, whether it's encouraging someone, like I said, with a phone call or visiting the sick, you know. And I fail in that as much as, you know, we all do, don't we? We all fail. But God is so gracious, and he helps us and gives us strength daily to go on.